I'd also like to highlight to you two further webinars this week, which are of particular importance. Tomorrow is going to be with Banco Central. And on Thursday, we have Jerry Concepcion. He's the presidential advisor on entrepreneurship and has been also active in discussing how business will operate with the government post the 15th, or post, obviously, whenever the ECQ will conclude. And I think that will be a very relevant presentation, and I would encourage everybody to join both the BSB and also the Jerry Concepcion. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you again. This is a very critical time, and obviously the more we can discuss and get prepared, it'll be extremely helpful. And once again, a great thanks to P&A Grant Thornton. And Caroline, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So first off, I would just like to share with you a little bit about the British Chamber. So we are supporting the development of our members' business and social interests in the Philippines and British communities. We represent over 300 member companies and individuals with a membership network of entrepreneurs and senior executives of multinational corporations and SMEs. This event is organized by the Overseas Partner Delivery Team, which is started in April 2014 in partnership with the UK Department for International Trade. So we assist UK SMEs in various sectors to grow and expand their market reach. We also do this by offering business support services for UK SMEs. If you would like to be connected to British expertise in the UK, we can also do that. Or if you are tuning in from the United Kingdom and would like to explore the Philippine market, we are open to assist you as well. We are an international affiliate of the British Chambers of Commerce and a member of Britain in Southeast Asia, which is a group of British chambers across Southeast Asia. So if you'd like to be connected with other British chambers in the region, just reach out to us as well. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker for today is a certified public accountant and a certified information systems auditor who brings over 19 years of experience providing total service delivery to clients for operational, transactional, and dispute management advisory across various industries. After being CIO of P&A Grant Thornton for 9 years, he now chairs the Technology Committee of the Partnership, which provides oversight over all IT operations, security, and technology change initiatives throughout the firm. So let us all welcome Mr. Third Librea, Advisory Services Leader of P&A Grant Thornton. I'll hand over the mic.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. So maybe just a little bit more about myself. So again, my name is Third Librea. I'm a management consultant with around 20 years of experience. I've gone through my fair share of helping various companies deal with crisis and problems. So I'm happy to see that there's how many participants. So there's quite a lot of participants. So normally this session that I run is done in a very interactive way, but there's quite a lot of us. So I think, Caroline, correct me if I'm wrong, we're having questions near the end. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So just a few reminders.
Okay.
If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can type it on the chat box.
All right. So most of the work I do is in risk management, transaction advisory, and IT consulting. So my presentation today is actually about a framework. So it's a framework for crisis management and recovery for businesses. So it's a general purpose framework with a wide range of application. Some specialized industries, this might not be applicable to them. It is a crisis management framework. It's not a public health or a government crisis management approach. Okay, so we normally in our consulting practice, we normally use this for companies that are experiencing distress or under stressful conditions. No? So maybe not as expansive as what is happening now, no? And with that it's affecting so many kinds of industries and companies. But hopefully, through my presentation, you can get some insights and nuggets of wisdom, and hopefully apply it to your very specific circumstances. So I think the goal of the event is not, the goal of my talk is not really to provide very specific solutions. Obviously, excuse me, in every company would have their own circumstances. But again, it's about insights, and later on in the end, hopefully we can share ideas with each other. So the framework at Grant Thornton, the framework, we call this the resilience wheel. Okay, so resilience, obviously, so resilience is defined as adapting or surviving amidst challenges, amidst difficulties, and then hopefully coming out better in the end. So that's what resilience is. The framework itself is called resilience wheel. And at the center of the resilience wheel is, wait, before we start there, maybe if you guys are familiar with the show Man versus Wild, so it's on, I think it's on National Geographic or Discovery, but essentially it's a show about survival. No? It's about what happens when one man is put into a very difficult situation. For instance, landing in the middle of the Amazon, and then what do you do, right? So just like that show, it's about survival. No? For businesses, the opposite of surviving is obviously liquidation, right? So liquidation or bankruptcy. So the question that the framework tries to address is, how do you minimize the chances of that happening? Okay. So, and that's why the center of the resilience wheel framework is liquidity. Okay. So robust cash flow management is at the very, very center of the framework. This ECQ has been going on now for almost 6 weeks. And while maybe at the start, a lot of the companies didn't really feel maybe that stressed yet, depending on the industry, that stressed yet about cash situations. As it extends, it is becoming more apparent to a lot of companies, okay, how important cash is in this kind of situation. So that's at the very center. So how you manage your cash, how you forecast and plan for cash. Okay, so that is at the very center of the wheel. So here at the very center. I hope you can see my cursor, right? And then right outside of that, the framework says that there are areas that impact short-term cash flow, right? So I'll be talking about each of these items throughout the presentation. So, and then after that, some wider considerations that we need to work through, right? And then, of course, all-encompassing is stakeholder engagement and communication. Very, very important in this situation that you get all stakeholders involved in the process of surviving. So by stakeholders, this is not just stockholders, these are employees, these are suppliers, these are customers, your bankers, your creditors, everyone. So liquidity is key, and you need to assess your cash on hand and what facilities you have that you can draw against. Do you have a credit line with your bank? Are there still funds that you can draw, right? So things like that. So you need to know what that is. So by now, most of you would know what that is. Maybe at the start, that wasn't really a primary consideration, but with the duration of the ongoing crisis, you would already know. And then your forecast, by robust cash flow management, I mean, you need to have weekly cash flow forecasts, and these should be 12-week cash flow. So that kind of detail. Okay. So as most of you have experienced in the past weeks, the situation is very fluid. It changes. Sometimes, almost every day, the situation changes, and you need to be able to react. And so the cash that you have on hand and the expected cash that you need to spend and receive becomes very, very important in terms of the crisis response decisions that you need to make. What's becoming even more apparent now, all right, I'll move on to the next slide. What's becoming even more apparent now is a lot of the help that the government is giving, okay, a lot of it is not really waivers. No? They're not waivers, they're not bailouts, they're all just deferrals. So you may have stretched supplier payments now, but I doubt if any of those suppliers have really, forgone any amounts due. No? Same thing with your landlords. So the DTI has already issued a memo on rent deferrals for MSMEs, right? So all businesses that are less than 100 million in assets, okay, their landlords have been required to not charge any penalties or interest for non-payment of rents. No? But again, that doesn't mean that rent is waived, right? So rent is just deferred, right? So once this quarantine is lifted, I am sure that all these suppliers, all these lessors are going to swoop down, and that's going to cause an even greater cash crunch on a lot of companies. But in any case, so that's a strategy which was deferring payments with landlords and banks. So if you can negotiate that with them now, okay. Sweep idle cash from other facilities into your working capital account. We're talking about things like maybe time deposits, less liquid kind of facilities. If you can move them maybe into your current or savings accounts, the reason for that is you might need cash at a moment's notice, so it's easier if you have them there. On the customer side, okay, it will be good to negotiate with customers to pay early. Okay, again, now the situation is that assuming that the lockdown is lifted on May 15, let's say, if it's lifted on May 15, right after that, everything becomes due and demandable, right? So unless government does something, no? But if they don't, then everything becomes due and demandable. And then if you don't have the cash from operations from your customers, you might have problems with that, right? So at this point, and hopefully in the last few weeks, you have been talking, your entire sales force has been going out, talking to customers, going on phone calls with customers, talking to them, asking them if they can pay early. Maybe, you could offer discounts for early payment. Let's say your trade terms are 30 days, but if, they might be willing to pay early if you offer some sort of a discount. The point behind this strategy is that you will have cash now for what's gonna come ahead, okay? Okay, this one I mentioned already. So quite a lot of relief that's been granted by government. So the BIR has already deferred tax payments. The Department of Finance has already communicated that all loans are not required to be paid at this point during the ECQ. DTI, as I mentioned, has already said that rents are not due for micro, small, and medium enterprises. The Department of Labor has already said that there is some subsidy, something that can be given to your employees if you're considered an affected organization. Okay, so there's some relief, but again, a lot of this relief are about deferring payments, but not waiving. So there's no, as of yet, there is no other support beyond that. One other strategy that is possible is maybe your insurance coverage covers pandemics. Okay, so let's say you are in the kind of industry where your contracts are long term, right? Your contracts with your customers are long term, and maybe there's some insurance there for non-completion of contract or cancellation of contract, not your fault, and maybe pandemics are included. Okay, so most insurance does not cover pandemic, but just in case, might be worth it to check now whether you might have coverage somewhere. Okay, so these are ways that you can, these are strategies that can immediately be implemented to protect and preserve your cash. So going back to the framework, what are those areas that impact short-term cash flow? So remember, at the center of the framework is robust cash flow management. Now, what are those immediate things, items that you need that will affect short-term cash flow? And these are the 6 items that are quite important at this point in time. So the first is workforce availability. And when the lockdown was announced, we actually just had around 2 days, right? So in Metro Manila, we had 2 days to decide on things. You know? So in 2 days, the workforce was going to be significantly reduced. So what did we need to do? You know, and a lot of companies had to make sudden decisions. So for instance, within those, I think in those 2 days, I had, for instance, I had a call, you know, from a client, and the client was asking me, "Third, do you have 900 laptops?" So he's in the BPO industry. You know? So third, do you have 900 laptops to spare? So of course I laughed at him. So who has 900 laptops to spare? You know? So, but what that shows is that he was exploring the possibility of making his BPO workforce work from home within that short period. And he had cash. You know, he had cash that he could spend on that kind of a decision, assuming, you know, that was available. But essentially the question is, how will your operating model need to change if your available workforce is suddenly reduced? So that was one example. There are other examples as well. So in manufacturing, a lot of the factory workers couldn't go to work, right? They couldn't go to work because of all the local lockdowns. There was no public transport, and they just couldn't go to work. So what's going to happen? So some manufacturers had to rent facilities, accommodations for their employees. They had to arrange for shuttle services to deal with the transportation issue of their employees. And so those obviously, you know, quite expensive, immediate impact on cash flow. For those in retail, so this was a sudden thing. You know? So if you operate a restaurant, in the travel industry, perhaps there was a sudden fall in demand. So what mitigating actions needed to happen if you experience that sudden fall in demand? No? So these were the questions that they had to ask, and the responses that companies had to this obviously would impact short-term cash flow. Excuse me, my apologies. Experience a sudden fall in demand. So what Jollibee did, for instance, so all their retail, a lot of their stores had to close, right? So their response now to that sudden fall in demand is to sell Chicken Joy in grocery stores. So frozen Chicken Joy in grocery stores. Okay, while that might not really be a direct fall in demand response, it does help. I think it was really a response to perishable inventory, so that's why they had to do that. No? But still, no. So it helps at least, no, in the fall in demand. If you're familiar with Healthy Options on the fly had to set up an online storefront. Okay, so what they did was they just took I think it was a simple online platform, an online POS, online merchant platform that they subscribed to. on the spot. No integration with their existing systems. Okay, but they were suddenly available online. They weren't before. No? So before it was just a catalog that they had on their website, but now you could transact and order on their website. So that was a response. Supply chain, distribution chain issues. So a lot of companies have been affected by this. So yeah, no. So the different local governments had to, well, they had different interpretations of the rules, no? And what happened was a normal delivery route that used to take 1 hour was suddenly taking, maybe 8 hours, something like that, during the early stages of the lockdown. And it was obviously affecting the distribution of goods. And sometimes the truckers didn't want to travel also. So that was a problem. So what if you were a company affected by this? What steps did you need to take, okay, to manage the supply distribution chain interruption? Also a strategy shift. Okay, so if you were in the middle of strategy implementation, so for instance, if you're a retail company and 2019 was a pretty good year, right? And a lot of retail companies were in expansion mode, thinking of adding more stores, adding more storefronts. And in early 2020, a lot of them would have started discussions with lessors on locking down spaces, locking down locations. So that's a strategy execution. So when the pandemic hit, okay, so obviously you have to examine, so that strategy, what does the current situation mean for the current strategy that I'm executing now? So obviously maybe put that on hold, right? So maybe stop discussions with lessors. If you were in the middle of issuing a check for a reservation deposit, maybe stop that. And so what actions were needed to adjust your business strategy? Conversely, if you were in the middle of a digital transformation project, so let's say you were developing your own online platform for an online storefront, right? So would you accelerate that? Okay, so things like that, no? So you need to accelerate that now, especially if you're already near the end of that project, so that you can respond to the fall in demand. Okay, a common blind spot of a lot of companies in relation to cash shortages are covenant breaches. So that means if you have a loan, okay, so if you have a loan with a bank, so normally loans with banks have covenants in them. For instance, maintaining liquidity ratios, maintaining certain ratios, right? The situation and the need for you to spend might have an impact on those ratios. So typically, a breach of a covenant triggers an immediate default. Okay, so that triggers a default and a demand for payment from creditors, right? So might be good to look at where you are now. If you have loans with banks, see if you've been breaching and have those discussions as early as possible with your creditors. Also, cash shortfalls arising from collections. So that's also a big blind spot. So typically, let's say you're a seasonal kind of business and summer is a good time for you. So supposedly in your normal forecasts, today would normally be a very good collection month, right? But that might not be the case, right? So in this situation, so in your forecast, that's why you need to get your sales force active and talking to customers and trying to get a feel for the situation of your specific customers. Because obviously, your customers will also be having these exact same problems. So what is your collection going to look like in May? So it's most likely will not be similar to the same period last year. And the more information you get from your discussions with your customers, the better, the less blind spots you have, and the more ability you have to manage the situation. Another area that can impact short-term cash flow is cash control. So For instance, these are things that you should have implemented, when the pandemic hit, right? So things like putting a freeze on certain kinds of expenses. So most likely, a lot of travel has already been canceled. But if business travel, no. But if your company is the type that needs to have these travels, you might need to put a hard stop to all of those. Maybe certain other kinds of expenses also need to be frozen. You might also need to implement more controls around who gets to approve cash releases, signs checks. So before, if the approval limits were at this level, maybe you need to tighten that a bit, no? So there's more control over cash. So these are 6 areas that impact short-term cash flow, and the questions around these areas will affect your cash flow forecasts. So what are the wider considerations? Okay? So the wider considerations really are in these 3 areas. So contingency planning. So for instance, right now, what we know is that the ECQ is going to be lifted by May 15, right? But that might not be the case, right? This is already I think we're already on, we've had one extension, right? So originally it's supposed to be March 13. That was the original end of quarantine. So that's been extended to the 30th. And that's also been extended now to the 15th. So there's no guarantee that the May 15 target date is going to be honored. Okay, so it will be good to plan for that. So what are those scenarios? So for your specific circumstances, you define the scenarios and what actions need to happen. Okay, so if we go back to the previous slides, and maybe also the items here in people that we're going to discuss. Maybe at the onset, you were fine, you felt that your cash flow situation was fine, you had reserves of this much, right? But as the pandemic progressed, you realized that your cash is getting a little tighter and tighter and tighter. And the situation is changing and you need to respond differently. So something that you decided before might not be something that will be applicable again. Let's say for a scenario where in the extension, there's going to be another extension, right? So what's going to happen? Okay, so you need to plan for that, no? So essentially just lay down the scenario. So for instance, the scenario is another extension of lockdown, right? So what do I need to do? Okay, do I need to start considering stopping completely my operations? Do I need to start considering, laying off people? Things like that, right? So these are kinds of actions that you need to decide on, depending on the scenarios that you've identified. Trigger points here are those that will start the actions. So for instance, on May 15 is the target date. If government does not make an announcement before X by this date, so let's say by May 10, if government doesn't make an announcement by May 10, okay, that's your trigger point for any actions that you can decide. So that's just an example. So again, as part of contingency planning, you might need to consider whether parts or all of your business can be suspended. Very difficult decision that you need to make, and what are the implications of that. On people, okay, some very, very difficult and tough decisions. There will always be a sensitive balance between maintaining employment and making sure your business survives. It's a very sensitive balance. And you will need to identify who your essential staff are, and you need to provide support to these essential staff to enable them to continue working if you have decided that you need to continue your business and not suspend it. Is it also possible for you to redeploy people, right? So if, for instance, in retail, obviously a lot of your front office is not working at the moment. No? So your cashiers are not working, your sales assistants are not working. Can you use them for something else? So let's say you're manufacturing. So let's say you're also a manufacturer and a retailer. So the goods that you manufacture, you have your own storefront. So can you put them? Can they work also in your factories? Okay, to service the demand coming from your online storefront. Things like that. So can you redeploy them, right? The cashiers in your stores, can they help out in finance, right? Okay, so those kinds of questions. Okay, you will also need to clarify absence policies, particularly as this, if you haven't done so yet, no? So, but you really have to be clear on that. No? So what is considered an absence? So everyone is working from home now. When is it really absent? Okay. So you might need to rethink that. No? When someone gets sick, okay, if someone gets sick in the current situation, okay, what is that? So in your current policy, that might be absence, but now is that still the correct policy to take? So again, one of those tough, difficult decisions that you need to work on throughout, and you need to actively discuss any solutions related to your workforce with your people, representatives of your people, like your unions, if you have a union, and of course, legal advisors. Right? This should be an ongoing discussion. We believe that there is a need for some transparency with employees, because your employees always need to know where they stand, and they need to trust messages from their leaders. It's particularly for Filipino companies, it's very hard to do this and to face employees and to tell your employees of the situation that your company might be in trouble, or that it might not be in trouble now, but if this lockdown continues for 2 more months, we are definitely in trouble. So messages like that are hard to deliver here, typically. But again, employees need to know where they stand, and they need to trust. Maybe, there might be ideas from employees on how they can help. They might have some ideas. So there, no. So also, of course, your crisis management team, which you should have formed already. So make sure that the crisis management team has representation from key departments. Again, we're trying to avoid blind spots. So you need to have representation from all. So for customers will be represented by your sales guys. Your vendors will obviously be represented by finance or purchasing, things like that. So not just the stockholders talking. Perhaps you need to have, obviously HR needs to be involved, as part of your crisis management team. Then you need to create hot planning groups for individual problems. For instance, that absence policy issue in the current situation. So how do you address that? So it might be good to get a subset of the crisis management team working on that attorney problem, for them to recommend something to the crisis management team, and then that's used for any actions. And within the crisis management team, communicate early, often, and frankly with the team. Okay. So those are the wider considerations. So that's the framework. Now, after, so will there be an after, which is the question. So what's floating around now, we often hear the term next normal, right? So what's the new normal, next normal? So that's really the aftermath. So this will end. Okay, there will be an end to the lockdown, right? But that doesn't mean really that it's an end of the crisis, right? And that's what's the next normal. So until a vaccine or a cure is found, things will change. So what kinds of questions do we need to ask ourselves for that time? So and that might be coming soon. So if the lockdown is lifted by May 15, right, that means that is going to be our normal. right? So even if that's what's called by the government as a general community quarantine, so still a quarantine, there's going to be some movement, there's going to be less restrictions, some easing, okay? But still, no, it's a different thing. It's not the same as how we were before the pandemic. And these kinds of questions you will need to ask yourselves, to adequately respond to that new normal. So in the area of strategy, a very important question is how will my customers' behavior change? Okay, the general community quarantine, well, on the IATF presentation, there was a mention that malls will start opening, no? But not all stores, no? But malls will be open. But still, as if you are a kind of business that has operations in malls, you still need to ask yourself, how will my customers' behavior change? Will they go to malls? We in my firm, internally, we've released a survey to employees asking them whether they are willing to go to the office. And a significant majority of the population mentioned that they are not willing to take that risk, right? So obviously that's a change in behavior. So even if there is an easing of restrictions, people might still not want to go out. So what does that mean for your business, right? And how will you respond to that? Okay. Another question that you might ask is, can my business be less reliant on manual labor and processes? So this is not just about IT, it's also about production line automation if you're in manufacturing, right? So it's all those kinds of automation, and might be really good to get people working on these problems. Now, what's great is that we have 6 weeks. So those companies that have decided to continue operations and work from home, what lessons have you learned from that experience? What were the challenges? What little process was there that made it a big problem when you were already working from home? So those kinds of questions might be good to ask in response when you are responding and thinking about the new normal. So how can the business be more agile to changes? It's a good question to ask, right? Particularly if you were slow in your response, or if you felt that your response was slow during the crisis, how can your business be more agile to this kind of situation? Also, how do I minimize my supply chain risk going forward? So if my supply chain was significantly affected, how do I do that? How do I minimize that? Okay, is there maybe for the future, I need to consider bringing some of my supply chain internally, meaning buying, assuming I have deep pockets, maybe I should buy some of my suppliers. Or maybe really start cultivating other suppliers rather than working on a sole supplier relationship, okay, just to diversify my risk. So those kinds of questions important to ask when you're looking at the new normal. For people and management, you will need to ask yourselves continuously, how do I protect my people until a cure or vaccine is available? How do I protect my employees until that period? Right? So what's going to happen to the office? What's going to happen at the factory, in stores, right? So how will I enforce physical distancing? What other, will I have to implement some kind of hoteling arrangement? Am I going to cap the percentage of people that need to go to the office? So questions like that, to protect your people until the cure or vaccine is available. Also, a good question to ask yourself is, did my organization's culture affect how I responded to the crisis? So were decisions too centralized on a few people that made it difficult to respond? So things like that. So what kinds of empowerment maybe do I need to implement going forward so that there is more agility in the organization. So what, also good question, what competencies were missing in my employees during the crisis? So I mentioned during the crisis, there is a lot of need to negotiate with customers, negotiations with suppliers, with creditors. So negotiation skills. So did my employees do a good job at doing this, right? Also IT skills. Okay, when people were working from home, did they know how to set up an online call? Did they have a lot of problems, right? So maybe some good areas to look at, from a strategic perspective. Facilities and IT, again, a very big work from home proof of concept is now here. And the question to ask is, do we really need this much office space going forward? Okay. Also, should we geographically disperse our operations? And another question is, given what happened, did I make the right investments in IT over the years? So it's a validation of things that you have spent on. Okay, so whether you've made the right decisions or not. Okay, and what that means to you going forward. Okay, for finance, might be good to ask after all this is done, what asset subsidiaries can I dispose of? Conversely, what can I acquire? Maybe there is a business there that you have been interested in the past that had a very challenging time during the crisis, but has a lot of intellectual property that is very valuable. So maybe that might be a good buy. So conversely, how do I integrate my cash cycle better? So in the Philippines, a lot of companies are still check-based. So business to business is still check-based rather than electronic. So, and some finance organizations have had to scramble in the first weeks of the pandemic on how to deal with the check signing issues. So I think a lot of those have been resolved now. So a lot of banks have dealt away with the physical forms required for enrolling businesses in electronic fund transfer facilities. So, and I think a lot of companies have now done that. So, but for the future, that might be the new normal, rather than relying on collectors, messengers going around collecting checks, etc. And maybe the new normal is really, the electronic fund transfer system and the payment system that has been pushed by the BSP for quite some years now. Also, a good question to ask. So how were my creditor relationships during the crisis? In the past weeks, we've been hearing very sad stories from clients about their bankers making it very hard for them at this point in time. So, before the crisis, it was all good. But right at when the crisis happened, suddenly the help seemed to have stopped. And despite them being very good being very good debtors, always paying on time, regardless of that. So even in some situations, for instance, there have been credit lines that have not yet been undrawn. When clients were starting to draw down on them, the banks were making it tough, right? So those kinds of so it might be good to ask yourself, how were these relationships during the crisis and what that means going forward, for you, from a strategic perspective. All right, so that concludes my presentation. I think, Caroline, now is a good time for question and answer.
Yes, thanks, Third. That
Thank
was
you.
actually a very practical approach on how we can strategize moving forward after this pandemic. If, yes, as you mentioned, if there will be an after soon enough. Are there any questions from our participants? You can type in your questions on the chat box, or you can unmute yourself also to ask our speaker a question. To start off, perhaps we can start with the question sent to us. This is in relation to those with relations to supplier relationship or third-party dependency. What can firms with supplier relationship and third-party dependency consider as we move forward into the new normal?
Yeah, that's I think that was one of the questions that I raised in the aftermath section. So it's really about diversifying your supply chain risk. So if you had a sole supplier relationship in the past, they may be, really analyze the situation. Are they really the only sole supplier? And by looking at other suppliers, will I be diversifying my risk? So those kinds of questions, because it's really about expanding. I think expanding your number of suppliers, number of vendors for a particular product. Of course, it's very difficult for certain kinds of industries and products. So let's say there is a particular quantity or very particular, very specialized kind of raw material, that you need for your operations, then that might be something that you need to discuss directly with that supplier on how you together, because I would think in that situation, that supplier is as important to you as you are to him, right? Hopefully, that's the situation in that kind of that kind of a relationship. Maybe you can work on the problem together on how you can mitigate that risk. Right. So, for instance, it's a very big example, but what Apple did with Foxconn, right? So, Foxconn it's a primary manufacturer for its iPhones, I think. So, what they did was they asked Foxconn to establish manufacturing facilities in other locations, not just in China. Right, so that's been going on for some years. So I don't know if Foxconn was actually able to create other plants in other parts of the world. But there, so that was a discussion between Apple and Foxconn. Maybe something like that you can also have with your suppliers on how you can minimize supply chain risk. Same thing with so the supply chain is not just your raw materials provider, so it's also your logistics. So how you get your raw material into your plants, right? So if you were working with a particular trucker or a particular logistics service, might be good to expand that. So obviously, depending on your territory, there might be some constraints. So not all logistics providers would be present in all territories, but might be good to explore that, again, to diversify risk, right? And, even if, for instance, if there's a problem with one particular logistics provider, there are other providers who can take the slack.
Right, thanks, Third. So also we have another question from one of our participants, Ms. Patty Camacho. How do you see the future of business lines such as sales that's heavy on face-to-face transactions?
Yeah, so that's actually very tough. So we're like that. So my business is like that. So for me to sell a service, I have to. The typical approach was, you network, you talk to customers face to face. So obviously, I cannot do that now. So things like this are what I'm doing, right? So hopefully, my thinking is by talking in these kinds of events, I'm able to create presence, and then hopefully some of you might be interested in exploring a consulting relationship with me. So that kind of approach, you will need to change how you sell, obviously, right? And that's going to be different per industry. But yes, so those kinds of industries where face-to-face selling is very important might have a very challenging time because the only venues are really these. Diba? So online forums, you can always have an online meeting with potential customers, so that's possible. So, but yes, so they have to adapt to to this situation where customers do not want to meet face to face, might not want to meet face to face.
And we also have another question in relation to changing to the changing consumer demands and the social distancing measures that will definitely be in place regardless if the ECQ will be lifted. Do you think shopping malls will still be relevant in the coming years?
Stopping malls, you mean?
Shopping malls, do you think they are still relevant in the coming years?
Well, it's a very good question. If actually there's a precedent for all this, no? But the precedent is almost a century ago. And I was reading through the Spanish flu and how it actually happened. No? So apparently, for the Spanish flu, it took 3 years. No, it took 3 years. There were yes. So there were three waves. So I think it started 1918, and it actually ended 1921, I believe. No, so if I recall the research that I did. No? So there were three waves around the entire world, and then throughout that time, people were not, no. So people were still not going out. They were afraid to go out. So there were no mass gatherings. And places where there was a lot of there were people congregated where didn't experience traffic. So obviously the scale is different now. No, our malls are much bigger than how they were a century ago. But I think we can. That is so to answer the question. I think if we apply that in 1 to 3 years, I think people will still avoid going to malls as much as possible. No, and there is a lot of play on social class. So the more knowledgeable the class, the more informed. Sorry, the more informed the class is, the social class is, the less they will be going to malls. Okay, I think that's my gut feel. At least in the next 2-3 years, right? So you plan for that, I think. So the question is, will malls be relevant? I think to the less informed social classes, they might honestly not care. No, so they might not. Sorry, pardon the no. They might not be as cognizant of the risks. Okay, they might not be as cognizant of the risks and will still go to malls. No, but the more informed people will not. Okay, but it's hard though to actually say, in terms of percentages, how many are going to go or not. Very tough question to answer.
Right, I understand. I know it's also something that's in consideration when we do go out after May 15 or not. And
What's that? Yeah.
Maybe we have another room for one or two more questions. So from the participants, if there are any others, you can or just type them in directly on the chat. While you do that, there is another question from our side. In the short term, how can companies mitigate exposure to risk in terms of forex value? This is for companies who are doing international trade.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry. I couldn't. It's a little noisy. Sorry. Is it noisy? The wind is noisy where I am. Sorry.
In the short to medium term, how can companies mitigate exposure to risk in terms of forex value? This question is from those businesses who are in the international import-export.
Yeah. So risk response. There's only 4 kinds of risk response that you can apply to any kind of risk, right? So the first one obviously is you can just accept the risk. Right. So sorry. Right. So if I'm going to have forex impact, then so be it. No, I can't do anything about it. So let's accept the risk. Second is you mitigate the risk. So how do you mitigate the risk? So one of the possible mitigations, and if you have the cash for it, is to enter into a hedging arrangement, okay, with your banks. No. So that's one. You can have discussions with your banks on how that can be implemented, right? So that involves buying a foreign exchange swaps, so things like that. No? So they might depends, no, on your relationship with your banks. If you have the money and can enter into a hedging relationship, that's one way of mitigating any risks from future settlement of a foreign currency valued transaction. So that's one way. Okay, so another way is to transfer the risk. So is it possible to get insurance for things like that? Maybe, I don't know. You can talk to your insurer if there's something like that. Okay, and then another way of transferring the risk is if the reason for the foreign currency transaction is obviously it's a transaction with a company in another territory, right, in a foreign jurisdiction. Is it possible to move that transaction and change its situs to the Philippines? Okay, so is that possible? Okay, so again, it's about exploring whether that supplier or that customer or that supplier, is there a supplier for that in the Philippines at a competitive price? Or if it's on the customer side, would you have similar customers in the country, right? So things like that. So that can be used to minimize the risks arising from foreign currency translation issues.
Okay, great. So I think that concludes our Q&A session for today's webinar, and also that concludes the webinar for adapting to COVID-19 challenges. Before we end, I would like to thank P&A Grant Thornton for hosting this webinar with us. Thank you, Mr. Third Librea, for your time.
My pleasure. I hope everyone is safe and well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for doing this. And lastly, if you would allow me, I would like to just share with you our contact details. As Chris mentioned, we have other webinars scheduled for the week. It's very timely if you have questions with regards to the situation up until the May 15th extension. So those are scheduled already this week. You can learn more about them on our website, www.britcham.org.ph, or you can follow and subscribe to our social media channels to learn more about these webinars. So again, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar as well as the presentation shortly after. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.